The camera sat where two rocks pinched together screen-cracked metal cold as a coin left in mountain shade. When I brushed the dust away, a tiny square of color bloomed water stones, a child's pack bright as a bluebird, and a long, thin shadow that didn't belong to the family at all. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I worked the north side of the park long enough to know the season by the sound of tires on the entrance road. Summer brings chatter and coolers rattling in pickup beds. Early fall brings quieter voices, early jackets, and the steady hush of folks who came for the elk bugle and the clean bite of 50-degree mornings. In September 2002, I was still on duty, still carrying a radio that rubbed a pale line on my hip, still unlocking the Slow Creek kiosk before sunrise, so the first hikers could sign the log without fumbling in the dark. My days started with coffee that tasted like tin from the old Ranger pot, and a quick look at the weather. High 60s, clear skies whined out of the west, 5 to 8 miles an hour. I would jot the forecast where everyone could see it, wipe the dust off the laminated map, and wait for the first set of boots to step out of the parking gravel. The Caldwells rolled in just after 8, a family that made you think of campfire pancakes and the sort of laughter that carries without getting loud. Sean had that posture I recognize in people who know their way around a topo map. Relaxed shoulders, eyes that track the ridgeline before they check the trail. He eased the tailgate down and spread his gear with the kind of care that keeps small things from getting lost. First aid kit on the right spare whistle, clipped high satellite phone wrapped in a bandana so it wouldn't knock around. Leona came over with the backcountry permit, a neatly folded page with their route circled in a blue pen that didn't smudge. She asked about a creek crossing and smiled when I told her the water sat ankle deep. Good for little legs, she said, and her hand settled on her son's head the way mothers do when they're measuring the day for weather and distance. Juniper carried a spiral notebook and a pencil sharpened down to a stub. She stood close enough to my desk to read the flower chart taped beside the map, mouthing the names under her breath. Lupine Indian paintbrush harebell, like a string of small prayers. Dalton hung back with a stuffed wolf tucked under his arm, the gray fur worn flat on the back where a child's hand had held it for years. He kept the toy's nose of stitched felt pointed at the trail the way boys use toy cars to drive on the edges of a table. When I clipped their permit to the board, I wrote their planned return time beside the date 6:00 p.m. In the margin, I noted 2 kids, not because the rules required it, but because it mattered to me. You watch differently when children are on the trail. You listen tighter to the radio. I knew families like them from the rhythm of the park. The father who double-checks the straps and calls each child by name before they step off the pavement. The mother who keeps a snack handy and a hat in her pocket for the afternoon sun. The quick roll call before they cross a log. The eyes on me whispered at a viewpoint. The Caldwells didn't smell like bug spray and panic. They smelled like coffee, clean wool, and those light granola bars everyone carried in 2002 oats and peanut butter, the wrapper crinkling as Sean slid a few into a side pocket. He lifted his camera and tested the shutter one click too. That sound carries in the thin air up there. It's a crisp button, a small promise that this day will be remembered. Miles called the ranger desk just after 9 to ask whether the little store still stocked ice and whether he could park by the upper loop if he arrived late. He wasn't worried. He sounded like a brother who looked forward to a simple evening bison steaks if he found them, or chili if he didn't, a borrowed lantern and the hum of other camps settling down. I told him to swing by the office for bear hang rope and pointed him to the row of public hooks where visitors could borrow what they forgot and return it after dinner. He laughed and promised he'd bring the rope back clean. He had one of those voices that makes you picture a man shrugging into a coat without checking the mirror, a man who puts an extra fork in the picnic basket because someone might stop by. By mid-morning, the day warmed toward 68 degrees, and the wind laid down. Pine scent hung low over the road, and the meadow across from the kiosk turned the color of wheat. A dozen cars came and went. Hikers taped moleskin to their heels and shook out their calves. A bus led off a small group of retirees who came in to ask where they might spot pronghorn. I marked down trail counts, picked up a candy wrapper grape torn cleanly down one side, and straightened the stack of safety leaflets no one reads until they've already made up their mind to go. At 11:20, I saw the Caldwell kids again, at the edge of the lot, Juniper tilting her head to line a sketch with the ridge, and Dalton holding his wolf by one ear, as if the toy was listening too. Leona swung her pack and pointed with two fingers toward a bend where meadow gives way to a strip of shade. Sean lifted the camera and backed up 3 steps to fit everyone in. From where I stood, it looked like a postcard child, blue child, green mother in a sun-faded ball cap, father in a windbreaker the color of spruce needles. People think of Yellowstone as a place of spectacle, bears sulfur geysers that throw boiling water into flawless sky. But the park's real life runs on small repetitions. The click of a gate. The hush before a distant elk call clears its throat in the timber. The tap of a pen against the trail register while someone spells a last name. My desk held a small bowl of mixed screws for the kiosk hinges and a stack of radio batteries warming in a patch of sun. Around noon, the maintenance shop sent a boy with a wrench to tighten a rattling vent, and we stood outside on the wooden porch elbows on the rail watching a pair of ravens cut across the meadow. I noticed a fresh set of tire tracks nosing toward a no parking sign and made a note to check them later. Little things. That's what a park is made of. You address them as they come. At the campground, a mile and a half away, the loop road creaked with fifth wheels and tent trailers settling in. The host raked a tidy ring at each site, pulling ash into a gray circle that looked like a coin pressed in dirt. Someone's radio drifted thinly through the trees until a spouse told them to turn it down. The store bell chimed as tourists pushed through the screen door for cold soda and a bag of ice. I walked through on my lunch check, nodding at a woman who'd bribed a toddler with a chocolate chip cookie and the promise of a nap. On the return path, my boots measured familiar distances, without my thinking 50 paces to the curve, 100, to the little footbridge, 20 more to the kiosk porch, where a slight groove in the plank caught my heel unless I stepped wide. Years of routine make a map in your body. I logged the early afternoon hikers as they trickled back from short loops, cheeks pinked by sun and wind, the relief and pride on their faces identical whether they'd managed 2 miles or 10. They told me what folks always tell rangers saw: a chipmunk heard a hawk, almost tripped, caught our breath. I checked off their names and watched the day lean west. Around 3, a thin band of cloud tugged across the ridgeline but never thickened. A pair of mule deer stepped into the meadow and then out again with quiet, deliberate knees. Somewhere a truck downshifted on the main road, the sound faint as a memory. If you looked at my notes from that day, they'd read like any other. Temperature, traffic, wildlife report, trailhead counts. But memory carries what paper doesn't. Leona's fingers brushing dirt from the kiosk sill before her boy set his toy there. The way Sean set the camera in the top of his pack instead of the bottom, keeping it close. Juniper chewing her pencil eraser, eyes narrowed as if the mountain might move if she looked away. Right then, none of it felt remarkable. It felt like watching a good day begin. I drove the short loop through the campground at 4 and saw an empty picnic table with a red checkered cloth clipped at the corners against a breeze that never came. Someone had left a small bag of yellow onions under the bench, the netting catching a bead of afternoon light. In the site next door, a couple sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs, hats tipped forward, a paperback sliding toward the man's lap as he drifted. The simple grace of camping, nothing urgent, nothing sharp. When I passed the store again, I saw Miles's pickup nosing into a spot near the propane cage. He stepped out with that quick, reluctant stretch of a driver who stiffened up on the road. He spotted me and gave a wave, that wide, unstudied gesture men use when a day is going the way it should. He asked about the best place to hang a food bag for old time's sake, he said. He'd grown up camping but hadn't done it much lately. I pointed him to a limb that held well over time, thick as a man's thigh, and 15 feet up, and told him the trick of tying a second line to the rock so you don't lose the first. He grinned, promised to do it the right way, and held up a cooler with a proud lift. "Dinner's simple," he told me. "Chili cornbread. If I can talk my sister out of those steaks she likes, I'll be a hero." We talked 15 minutes about nothing that would matter later, and everything that mattered then, how the bison were moving farther east this week, how the store clerk swore he saw a wolf at dawn, how quickly the air chills after sunset in September. He asked whether the kids could roast marshmallows after dark if they stayed close to the coals. I told him yes and reminded him how sparks jump when pine pitch catches. At the kiosk, I tightened one hinge and signed off on a work ticket. The shadows pulled longer across the meadow, and the elk calls started to thread together the way they do when evening gathers itself. I turned the radio down a notch to catch the nuance of a call coming off the timber line, a tremble that tells you the bull means it. A boy of about 12 wandered in to ask if he could keep a found feather. I told him no, but he could keep the story of where he saw it, which is almost as good. He understood more than most adults do. When he left, he folded his hands behind his back in that stiff, careful way boys have when they're doing something righteous. Late afternoon brings a specific light to Slow Creek. It's thin and honey-colored at first, then it flakes into late gold, and then the whole meadow seems to pause as if the day's last breath is a held note. I made one more round of the pit toilets, jotted down supplies for morning, and set the kiosk windows to half open so the glass wouldn't fog after dark. At the campground, a handful of stoves clicked to life. The onion bag was gone from under the table. A Dutch oven lid clinked. Someone laughed 3 sites over. A child asked for the 100th time if it was time for s'mores. I remember the sound of a cooler lid closing. 6 o'clock came soft as a hand to the shoulder, and I didn't think anything of it. Families come in at 6:10, 6:20, with excuses you can predict. The view was too good. We stopped to watch a hawk. We took our time. I checked the trail register and ran my finger down the list. A father with a tired 8-year-old signed out at 5:42. A pair of college kids came in at 5:58 with rosy faces and a photograph of themselves pretending to push over a dead lodgepole. I wrote them a warning and then pretended to admire the mountain anyway. The air cooled enough to pull a sweater over my uniform shirt. I turned on the low porch light at the kiosk and stepped outside to let the lamps adjust my eyes. At the far end of the campground loop, a lantern came on in one of the sites. The glass glowed butter yellow. Across the road, a pickup door shut, and the driver did that small hop men do when they're adjusting jeans that don't fit like they used to. I saw Miles at his table kneading a paper bag around a loaf of cornbread mix, a spoon jutting from a bowl, a grin thrown toward the fire ring as if he could already taste dinner. He checked his watch the way you check when you expect laughter any minute. He looked down the road once, then again the second time longer. A breeze pushed through the meadow and set the grass to a slow, even lean. The porch bulb buzzed over my head, and a moth shouldered against the glass and fell away. By 6:30, the silhouettes at the loop flattened into a single soft line, and the first real night air pressed in from the creek. I reached for the radio without thinking, and then let my hand rest there, casual, not wanting to spook a quiet. Somewhere a zipper whispered on a tent door. A pot lid lifted and settled with a dull ring. The elk calls thinned to distance. I watched the road where the trees part in an easy S-curve and waited for headlights to swing through and break the dark in the friendly way we take for granted, the way that says a day ended where it was supposed to. The light never came. Miles lit the lantern and kept it burning a little brighter than you usually do. And I left the porch light on longer than I had any reason to. I remember how the light changed that evening, how it slid down the valley in thin amber bands until the trees stood in silhouette against a cooling sky. At first there was nothing unusual about the quiet. The park always hushed itself before dark, letting the wind settle and the creek hum steady beneath the sound of distant elk calls. But that night, the silence felt different, like something missing rather than something complete. From the kiosk porch, I could see Miles's lantern glowing down the loop bright enough that it touched the branches above his sight. He was still waiting, sitting with one knee pulled up, head turned toward the road. I told myself the family must have stopped for pictures. Every parent wants one last shot before the sun goes down. Still, by the time the first stars pricked through the dusk, I had that feeling in my stomach I only get when the woods are keeping something to themselves. I gave them another hour. I went over the trail log again, tracing my finger down to the line where I'd written their return time. 6 o'clock, I'd marked it clean. They were good hikers, steady, not reckless. Families like the Caldwells didn't just disappear off the Slow Creek Loop. At 8:30, Miles walked up from his campsite, his flashlight jerking a little in his hand. He tried to sound calm when he said they hadn't come back, that maybe they'd taken the long route. Maybe the kids got tired and they'd stopped somewhere for a rest. I could hear what he didn't say. The wind had picked up and it carried that dry, high whistle through the pines that makes you tighten your jacket without thinking. I asked him to wait inside the office while I called it in. Ranger Dispatch answered on the second ring. I explained who was overdue, where they'd been headed, and how long they'd been gone. When I said Sean's name, the pause on the other end stretched a beat too long. Everyone knew him at least by reputation, a man who could fix a busted water pump in a thunderstorm and still make it to his daughter's soccer game the next morning. The dispatcher said she'd start the overdue procedure, told me to hold the line while she looped in backcountry command. The radio crackled once, then cleared. I gave coordinates, weather, terrain. They told me to stay put until the overnight team arrived from Mammoth. Miles stood by the window, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "They're fine, right?" he asked. "They know what they're doing." I wanted to tell him yes. Instead, I said what the manual says to say. Most families show up right about now. But the truth was, we rarely had to talk about missing people who knew the park as well as Sean did. By 10, the first search team rolled in 2 rangers, a paramedic, and a volunteer who'd been through this before. We laid out the map on the desk, the lamplight cutting a bright oval across the contours. The trail was a loop 6 miles total, mostly clear, with 2 points where an unmarked spur could fool a newcomer. But the Caldwells weren't newcomers. They'd hiked it every year. I couldn't shake the wrongness of it. We started at dawn. Helicopters were grounded until sunrise, so the first team went on foot. I took the lower approach toward the meadow where the creek widened into shallow water, the spot that always drew photographers in the morning mist. Dew soaked through my pant legs before the first mile. We called their names, short bursts, a pause, then again, each one swallowed by the stillness. I remember the smell of sulfur faint in the air. That meant thermal vents nearby. You never trust the crust around them. One misstep, and you're through. But Sean would have known that better than any of us. I kept replaying his last smile in my mind, the way he adjusted the strap on his pack, how certain he'd looked. By noon, the helicopters were up. Their blades sent white dust pluming from the ridgelines, the noise echoing for miles. They covered every direction from the main loop to the canyon edge. Ground teams combed the brush line grid by grid. The dogs picked up nothing. No footprints, no wrappers, not even a bent blade of grass. It was as if the family had stepped off the trail and dissolved. Back at base, I watched the updates come in on the whiteboard. Every box stayed blank. Missing 4. 0 leads. That night, we expanded the perimeter. I briefed new volunteers, college students, retired couples, anyone who'd driven in from nearby towns. I told them what to look for: bright fabric reflective material, broken twigs no more than a day old. I told them not to fixate on the stories they'd already heard. People start talking after 24 hours. They mean well, but talk becomes noise. By the second morning, noise was all we had. A digital photo came through early that day, forwarded from Park IT. It was the last image sent from Sean's camera to Leona's email before they vanished. Juniper and Dalton were standing by a creek, laughing. Sean's reflection rippled faintly in the water beside them. The timestamp read 11:47 a.m. I stared at that image longer than I should have. In the background, you could see the edge of a ridge, part of the route that curved toward hell-roaring canyon, steep, unstable, the kind of terrain we warned families away from. It wasn't on their permit, but maybe they'd gone there for a better view. Maybe. I printed the photo and tacked it to the board above the maps. We kept searching for weeks. Every morning began with the same crackle of radios, the same roll call of units. We found their campsite untouched, the tent still zipped cooler, full shoes, lined neatly by the fire pit. It looked like they'd left for a morning stroll, not a 6-hour hike. That's what made it worse. Families who wander usually leave a trace of hurry, a half-packed bag, a mug turned over in the dirt. The Caldwells left order behind as if they expected to come back for lunch. Miles stayed through it all. He hiked alongside us when we'd let him restless in the way only family can be. He'd call out their names until his voice broke, then walk in silence for a while. At night, he'd sit near the command tent, watching the maps under lamplight, asking the same questions we couldn't answer. I tried to keep my voice even when I said we'd keep looking, that weather sometimes hides clues until it decides to give them up. But by the third week, the nights turned colder and the searchers fewer. Funding shifts, priorities change, and even grief has to wait its turn. The command post came down before the first snow. Years passed like that. The case file got smaller each time someone copied it into a new binder, as if paper could shrink what it carried. Every so often, I'd get a call from a visitor who swore they'd seen a bright backpack off trail or a flash of blue in the brush. I'd drive out, walk the area myself, find nothing. Yellowstone doesn't give up its dead easily. Some vanish into the springs, others into the snowmelt or the mouths of caves the maps don't even show. Still, the Caldwells never felt lost to me. They felt paused, waiting somewhere just beyond what we could reach. Then, 5 years later, in August of 2007, a man walked into the Lamar Ranger Station carrying a small silver camera in his hand. His name was Gideon Wells, an off-duty firefighter who'd been hiking a narrow canyon near the river when he spotted something wedged between two boulders. He said it looked out of place, too clean against the weathered rock. When he powered it on, the screen flickered but worked. "You might want to see this," he told me, and set it on my desk like it might burn through the wood. I recognized it immediately, the same model Sean used, the same worn strap knotted at the corner. My hands went cold just looking at it. The casing was scuffed, but the lens was intact. Gideon scrolled through a few photos before I stopped him. He said there were images of the family, clear ones dated the same day they disappeared. He'd written down the coordinates where he found it. I thanked him, got his statement, and sealed the camera in an evidence bag. When the door closed behind him, I sat for a long while, listening to the hum of the fluorescent light above me. By the time the forensics courier arrived, the air outside had turned metallic with the promise of rain. I filled out the chain of custody form and sent the package to the state lab in Cheyenne. I knew the technician they'd assign Mara Keene patient as a surgeon when it came to digital recovery. I called her personally and asked for care on this one. She didn't ask why. She could hear it in my voice. Days stretched. Each evening I'd check the weather reports and half expect to see something. Anything changed, like the world owed us a sign. Then one night my phone rang after dark. Mara's voice came soft, but I could hear the hum of her equipment in the background. She said the memory card was still alive, that she'd recovered 47 photos and one short video. "You'll want to come see," she added. Cheyenne was a 6-hour drive. I made it in 5. Her lab was a clean room of glowing monitors and steady machine noise, the kind that keeps your mind from drifting. On the screen were thumbnails of a day frozen in perfect clarity, breakfast by the creek, a sketchbook open in Juniper's lap. Dalton grinning with his stuffed wolf held high. They looked happy, so happy it made my throat close. Then Mara opened the last image. Sean knelt beside a narrow stream, his windbreaker bright green against gray rock. Behind him, faint but certain, stretched a shadow. Long, human, and not his own. I asked her to zoom in. The pixels blurred but held enough shape to suggest someone standing just beyond the frame. No face, just the angle of a shoulder and what looked like the edge of a walking stick. I thought about that canyon, how far off the main trail it ran, and how few people ever went that deep. It didn't make sense. The Caldwells had no reason to be there. They were careful, methodical. For them to end up in hell-roaring canyon, something had to pull them off course. Mara clicked over to the video file. It lasted 12 seconds. Leona's voice carried through the speakers light and calm, talking about the geyser basin across the ridge. Then the camera jolted, tilted toward the ground, and the image cut out. She replayed it with enhanced audio isolating background noise. Over Leona's narration came another sound, faint rhythmic like someone walking just out of frame. The cadence didn't match the family's movements. It was slower, heavier, and at the tail end, almost buried beneath static, came a low murmur. 2 words indistinct. She played it again. I caught them the second time. Keep moving. I felt the hair rise on my arms. It wasn't Sean's voice, and it sure wasn't Leona's. The timbre was rough, older a man used to talking to himself. Mara looked at me without speaking. We both knew what it meant. That camera hadn't been left behind by accident. Someone else had been there. Back at the park, I reopened the file, the old pages crackling like dry leaves. The first night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt like footsteps on gravel. I kept seeing that shadow stretched across stone, hearing the quiet command buried in the noise. For 5 years we'd told ourselves they must have wandered, that the park had taken them in the way it sometimes does. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning I gathered a small team, men and women I trusted, rangers who'd walked every hidden corner of Yellowstone and knew how quickly hope can turn into hazard. We loaded our packs with enough for 3 days and headed toward the coordinates pulled from the camera's GPS data. The trail climbed through pine and shale, then dropped into the kind of terrain that swallows sound. The air smelled of sulfur and wet stone. Somewhere out there in a canyon, the maps barely named a family had vanished, and maybe, just maybe, the earth was finally ready to give back a piece of what it took. That's where we were when the first gust hit, scattering pine needles across the path and setting the ravens to cry overhead. I looked at the horizon, gray clouds building fast, and felt that old familiar knot settle low in my chest. Whatever waited in that canyon had been hidden a long time. And as we started down the slope toward hell roaring, I knew this wasn't going to be the kind of search that ended with rescue. It was going to be one that ended with truth. We moved into hell-roaring canyon just after sunrise, each of us quiet in that way people get when words don't help anymore. The air had that mineral edge, wet stone, and sulfur that sticks in your throat. I led the line following the GPS coordinates from the camera file. Behind me were Ranger Cole and Dr. Nicholas Adams, a geologist who'd studied the canyon walls for years. Every step felt deliberate, the ground slick with gravel that wanted to shift under your boots. It was a place most visitors never saw, too rough, too steep, too easy to get turned around. Down there, the wind hardly reached, and the only sound was the scrape of rock against rock as we moved. We were 3 hours in when we found the first clue. It wasn't dramatic, just a child's sneaker wedged under a boulder, the kind you'd buy at a big box store caked with dried mud. The brand and size matched what Leona had listed on their permit form. Dalton's. 7 years old. I remember kneeling in the dirt, brushing the dust from the tiny heel. For a second it looked almost new, like something dropped that morning not 5 years earlier. Cole called out from a few yards away that he had fabric caught on a thorn, a scrap of blue nylon, torn but bright. Juniper's backpack had been that color. We stood there longer than we probably should have, the canyon pressing down around us, knowing what those two small pieces meant. They'd been here. We kept following the coordinates deeper in. The path narrowed and the temperature dropped until our breath showed in the air. The canyon's name made sense now. Every sound was swallowed whole. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Around noon, Nicholas stopped and pointed to a low overhang where the gravel looked disturbed. "Shelter," he said quietly. He brushed away a thin layer of dust and found a rusted granola bar wrapper half buried beneath. It was the same brand Sean had carried that day, the one I'd seen him pack at the trailhead. I remember how carefully he'd stacked those bars like he was planning for every mile. That wrapper felt heavier than it should have. Inside the overhang was a shallow cave, cool, dry, no sign of collapse. It would have made sense to stop there if someone was hurt, or if the weather turned. But there was no gear, no bones, no sign they'd slept there. Just silence, and the faint smell of old earth. I ran my hand along the wall. The rock flaked away like dry clay. It hadn't been touched in years. They'd passed through but not stayed. We marked the coordinates, photographed everything, and hiked back to the rim before the light died. When I radioed in what we'd found, command went quiet on the other end. You could hear papers rustling, someone whispering. It's the kind of silence that comes before decisions you don't want to make. Back at base, Dr. Mara Keene was still working the camera files. She'd pulled more data out of the memory card images corrupted at first glance, but recoverable with enough patience. One frame stood out. A blurred figure holding what looked like a stick standing near a rock formation. The shape wasn't clear, but something about it felt off. It didn't match Sean's frame or clothing. When Mara compared the shape to known park citations from 2002, a name surfaced: Harlan Tate. A drifter, middle-aged, cited for illegal camping near Slow Creek 2 weeks before the Caldwells vanished. He was known for carrying a hand-carved walking stick, the kind that left a shadow shaped just like the one in Sean's last photograph. I'd heard of him. Everyone in the Ranger Corps had. A man who slipped in and out of the park boundaries, living off discarded gear and fish from restricted streams. He never caused enough trouble to jail for long, but his presence lingered like smoke. When Agent Tessa Breyer from the FBI joined the case, she brought his file with her thick, worn pages smudged by a dozen jurisdictions. Assault in Montana, trespassing in Idaho, theft charges that never stuck. He knew the woods better than most of us. And then after 2002, he vanished. No tax record, no arrest, nothing. We went back into the canyon with a new purpose. This time, the team included cadaver dogs trained to work in rugged terrain. The first day, they ranged ahead, noses to the ground, tails stiff. For hours, nothing. Then, near a deep fissure where the rock opened like a wound, one of the dogs stopped short and began to bark. The handler knelt, spoke softly, and the animal whined low, pressing its nose toward the crack in the earth. The opening was too narrow to enter safely, but when Nicholas lowered a small camera on a line, the feed showed what looked like old fabric caught in the rubble. When the light hit it just right, I could see gray fur the same color as Dalton's stuffed wolf. I'll never forget the way the canyon air felt then, heavy and still. That toy had been in his arms when they set off that morning. It was the one thing he wouldn't let out of his sight. Now it lay half buried beneath a wall of rock 5 years gone, and somehow still waiting to be found. We pulled it out carefully, the seams stiff, the stitching faded. I set it in an evidence bag and sealed it. The smallest things are the ones that undo you. Back at camp, Mara had isolated more audio from the video clip. She found a low voice between the footsteps, deeper, this time, clearer. "Don't turn around," it said. 3 words, slow, deliberate, the kind of tone a man uses when control matters more than speed. She compared it to a recording from Harlan's 2005 arrest in Idaho. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to make your skin crawl. Agent Breyer took that as reason to dig deeper. Her team scoured pawn records and found a sale from 2003, a child's blue backpack with a torn strap sold by a man named Tate for $20 in Bozeman. The shop owner remembered him nervous, unshaven, with a walking stick wrapped in leather cord. That backpack had been Juniper's. I didn't want to believe it, but the details lined up too cleanly. He'd kept what wasn't his and moved on. We pressed farther into the canyon, working the fissure area with ground-penetrating radar. The images came back showing voids beneath the surface, irregular like tunnels or small chambers. Nicholas said flash floods could carve spaces like that, then seal them over time. The theory made sense. A flood in 2003 could have shifted debris, burying whatever was left beneath new rock. If the family had been trapped or killed near the fissure, the flood would have hidden them completely. Still, we searched. Every stone we moved felt like reopening an old wound. On the fourth day, we uncovered a bent tent pole wedged in a crevice and a scrap of green nylon snagged on the rock, a match to Sean's windbreaker. Each find confirmed we were on the right path and deepened the ache that we might be too late for anything but proof. When the reports came back from Bozeman, Agent Breyer shared them in the command tent. There'd been another pawn sale a few months after the first, a woman's wristwatch with an inscription on the back, "To Leona Forever Sean." The words etched shallow but clear. My throat closed when I read them. She'd worn that watch every day. I remembered the sunlight catching it at the trailhead as she signed the permit form. That meant Harlan had not only been there, he'd taken trophies. And trophies meant intent. We spent that evening by the fireless camp, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. The canyon walls glowed dull red under the setting sun. Nicholas talked quietly about the geology, how the springs beneath could dissolve a body in days if the conditions were right. He didn't mean to sound cold, it was just fact. Yellowstone hides its secrets in boiling water and stone. I kept thinking about the camera, how it had survived years of storms when flesh and bone hadn't. Technology outlasting humanity. It felt cruel. A storm rolled in that night, sudden and violent lightning flashing along the ridge. We took shelter under the tarp, listening to the rain hammer the earth. In the distance, the springs hissed and the ground trembled faintly, a reminder that the park was alive in its own dangerous way. When it passed, the air smelled burned metallic. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowed figure standing behind Sean, the raised stick, the voice saying not to turn around. It replayed in my head until the sky lightened again. The next morning, the cadaver dogs hit on a second area closer to a steaming pool where the ground was soft. When we probed the soil, a metallic clang echoed back. It was a backpack buckle melted and warped the nylon straps long gone. Chemical tests later showed traces of human DNA too degraded to identify. The heat and minerals would have erased almost everything else. We stood there a long while staring at the mist curling up from the water's edge. I realized then that we might never find their bodies, not in a way that could be carried out or buried. Yellowstone had a way of keeping what it took. But even if the canyon refused to give us bones, it had given us a name. Harlan Tate, the man who had been warned, fined, and forgotten. The man who'd been here before and after they disappeared. We'd found his trail in pawnbroker ledgers and on corrupted pixels in the faint echo of a command caught on tape. Every piece led back to him. Agent Breyer sent the warrant request before nightfall. His last confirmed sighting had been in an Idaho transient camp 3 years earlier. She told me not to get my hopes up. Men like that slip through the cracks. They always do. I went back to my tent and laid the evidence bags out on the table. Dalton's stuffed wolf Juniper's torn fabric, the photo of the shadow. Each item was its own small voice whispering the same thing. They didn't just vanish. Someone made them vanish. Outside, the canyon wind stirred again, carrying the low hum of thermal vents. It sounded almost like breathing, steady, patient, eternal. And as I listened, I knew this search wasn't finished. Somewhere out there, Tate was still moving, still hiding. and the truth, whatever it was buried just a little deeper than we'd dug. The fissure looked like it had been split open by something ancient, wide enough to swallow light deep enough that your breath seemed to disappear when you leaned over it. The air coming out was cold, but not clean. It carried that mineral smell, a mix of iron and decay, with a heat underneath you could feel in your bones. We'd been marking the area since dawn, working slow, measuring depth, sound, and soil. When I finally stepped to the edge, I could hear the whisper of water below, steady far away like something alive and patient. Dalton's stuffed wolf had been found just yards from that opening. I couldn't shake the feeling that if we left, it would all close back up, and no one would ever find what was left. The National Park Service sent a team from Denver, a specialized group trained to stabilize unstable rock. They came with equipment that looked out of place in that canyon: steel supports, canvas braces, heavy ropes slick with grease. Their voices carried up the slope, calling coordinates codes, numbers that didn't mean much to anyone except the men who used them. I stayed near the edge, radio clipped to my shoulder, watching the ridge above us glow orange in the morning sun. For a moment it was beautiful, almost peaceful. Then the drill started and the sound tore through the valley like thunder. While the crew worked, Agent Breyer was 100 miles away in a sheriff's office in Idaho chasing a lead. A transient had been arrested in 2005 for stealing from a gas station. The name he gave was false, but the fingerprints were real. They matched Harlan Tate. He'd skipped town before sentencing, disappeared again like smoke. A deputy found an old booking photo, a gaunt face beard down to his collar, and in his left hand that same carved walking stick. When Tessa called me that night, I could hear the fatigue in her voice. "He's still out there," she said, "and I think he's done running." By the third day, the engineers broke through to a lower chamber about 10 feet down. When they climbed out, one of them was holding a small plastic case in gloved hands. Inside was a lens cap, the initials SC scratched into the metal. Sean Caldwell. I felt my throat close. It wasn't Bones, but it was his. Nearby, they found the remains of a notebook, pages fused from moisture but still legible in places. Leona's handwriting, wildflowers and field notes, the same list she'd been teaching her children on that trail. There was something heartbreaking in the ordinariness of it. She'd written the names of flowers right up until the day she vanished. We logged everything, packed it for the lab, and went back down for one final sweep. That's when I heard Mara's voice come over the radio, urgent and quiet. She'd recovered another fragment from the memory card, an audio file this time. I remember walking out of the canyon to better signal dirt streaked across my hands while her voice came through the static. "You're not going to like this," she said. Then she played it. At first it was wind and the shuffle of boots on gravel. Then a man's voice, low, rough, close to the microphone. "Don't turn around, just that." A pause. Then a faint sound that might have been someone gasping or a hand over a mouth. I don't remember breathing while it played. When it ended, neither of us spoke for a while. Then Mara said, almost in a whisper, "It matches the pitch from the Idaho recording." That night I sat by the camp stove, staring at the evidence bags laid out on the table. The windbreaker fragment, the notebook, the stuffed wolf, and now the recording. One by one the pieces were aligning into something undeniable. The Caldwells hadn't fallen, hadn't wandered into a spring. Someone had cornered them. I kept seeing the photo of that blurred figure with the stick standing just behind Sean. 5 years of nothing, and now the truth was rising through the cracks. By morning, the canyon gave us one more sign. When the crew shifted debris near the fissure wall, a glint of metal caught the light. It was a small hair clip, silver shaped like a butterfly, the kind a child would pick out herself. Juniper had worn one just like it at the trailhead that day. I'd noticed it because she'd tucked a strand of hair behind her ear before sketching the flowers on my desk. I remember thinking how careful she was, how much she resembled her mother when she smiled. Now the clip sat in my hand, cold and heavy, the tiny hinge fused with rust. Dr. Adams studied the fissure walls, running his fingers along the smooth inner rock. He said it had once been open, then sealed by flood sediment and geothermal shifts. His best guess, the 2003 storm we'd logged that spring had sent water racing through enough to move debris and carry smaller objects away. "If they were in here," he said quietly, "they're farther down now, too far for us to reach without breaking the whole formation." He looked at me, and I knew he was trying to give comfort with facts. But facts felt useless in a place like this. While the field team packed up, Tessa sent word that the pawn trail had led her to another town, this time in Wyoming. In 2003, a man matching Tate's description sold a woman's wristwatch engraved with the name Leona. The shop owner described him as nervous sweating like someone who hadn't been indoors for a long time. The watch was recovered, the inscription still clear. It was the last gift Sean ever gave her. Finding it in a pawn ledger felt like a confession. We built a timeline that night. Tate had been living rough in Yellowstone's backcountry for months, probably poaching or scavenging. The Caldwells, with their camera and field gear, must have stumbled on him. Maybe they caught him on film without realizing it, and he panicked. I tried not to picture what happened next, the confrontation, the raised stick, the voice telling them not to look back. But it was impossible not to imagine the moment their family hike turned into terror. The canyon grew darker as clouds thickened. By afternoon, rain was threatening again, and the engineers warned that another storm could collapse what was left of the fissure. We had hours, maybe less. The dogs were restless, pacing near a steaming spring where the ground was soft and cracked. When one barked sharply, we moved in. Beneath a thin crust of soil, a ranger's probe struck something solid metal again. A backpack buckle burned and warped. We lifted it out with care. The nylon straps were gone, but a fragment of charred fabric clung to it, melted into black lace. The lab later confirmed traces of human DNA degraded almost to nothing. The spring's acidic water had likely destroyed whatever else remained. When you've worked enough of these cases, you learn how the landscape becomes complicit. It hides things. It reshapes truth until it looks like weather like time. That evening, as the wind came down the canyon, I stood by the fissure and listened to the low rumble beneath my boots, the sound of boiling water miles below, always moving. I thought about how easy it would have been for a man like Tate to vanish into this same wild. The park could erase a family in a day and swallow their killer just as easily. Later around the table, Tessa spread out her notes. The watch, the backpack, the audio, each piece of evidence circled his name tighter. She looked older than she had the month before the hunt, wearing thin around her eyes. "We'll find him," she said. I wanted to believe her, but I'd spent too long watching what the wilderness does to evidence and to hope. Still, the next morning brought a new thread. A hunter in Montana came forward after seeing news of the reopened case. He claimed he'd met a drifter in a bar in 2003, a man who bragged about fixing a problem in Yellowstone, said he'd shown off a child's hair clip as proof. The hunter had kept it all to himself for years, afraid of getting involved. Now he handed it over to authorities. It matched the butterfly clip perfectly. That was the moment the last doubt left me. Harlan Tate wasn't just an unlucky witness or a man who found what we couldn't. He was the one who'd taken them. The FBI released his photo to every agency west of the Rockies. His trail stretched from Idaho to Oregon, then went quiet near the Nevada border. For every lead, a dead end. For every sighting, another ghost. Meanwhile, the canyon gave up its last message before the rain drove us out. A drone sweeping the upper ledges caught something glinting high on a cliff metal dangling from a frayed rope. We climbed as far as we could and found a carabiner etched with scratches, part of Sean's climbing gear. Below it, wedged in a shallow crevice, was a crumpled drawing, faded but still readable. A wolf drawn in crayon, the word "Echo" scrawled underneath. Juniper's hand. The picture was smeared where water had run through it, the colors bleeding like tears. When I brought it back to camp, Miles was waiting. He'd arrived the day before, pale from the drive, but determined to see the place for himself. I didn't have words for what I handed him, just the drawing sealed in plastic. He held it to his chest for a long time, not crying, not speaking. Then he said, "At least now I know they didn't just disappear." That night a storm rolled in from the west. Rain came in sheets, hard enough to shake the tents, and we knew we couldn't stay. The fissure would flood the ground, would shift again, and whatever evidence was left would sink deeper into the earth. Before we broke camp, I stood at the rim one last time. The wind carried the smell of sulfur and pine sap, and for a moment I thought I heard voices in it, just echoes but familiar. The canyon was closing in again, hiding what we'd uncovered, keeping its secrets. As we hiked out under that cold gray sky, Tessa got a call from Nevada. A deputy near a trailer park outside Reno thought he'd seen someone who matched Tate's description, a man with scarred knuckles and a limp traveling alone. She didn't say a word, just quickened her pace. I knew that look. The hunt wasn't over, not by a long shot. The canyon disappeared behind us, swallowed by fog. I glanced back once at the place where the family's laughter had last been heard, and where their lives had been taken from them. The rain washed the prints from our boots almost as soon as we made them, and by the time we reached the ridge, the ground was smooth again, as if none of us had ever been there at all. I remember the sound of the rain that morning. It wasn't hard or hurried, just steady, like the land itself was exhaling after keeping too much in for too long. We'd been walking out of hell-roaring canyon for nearly 2 hours, our boots sinking into the kind of mud that erases footprints as soon as they're made. Behind us, the storm swallowed everything, the fissure, the springs, the cliffs that had once glowed gold in the sun. The canyon had taken them back the same way it had taken the family 5 years earlier. I didn't look back again. Some places aren't meant to be stared at for too long. We made it back to the command trailer by noon. The heaters were running, drying the wet gear, the smell of metal and sweat hanging thick in the air. Tessa sat near the radio, her head bowed over a stack of printouts. The phone rang once, twice, then she answered. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I knew before she spoke. "They found him," she said so softly it almost didn't sound real. Harlan Tate had been living out of a derelict trailer in the Nevada desert miles from anywhere. A local deputy had spotted the scar across his knuckles, the same one visible in that final frame from the camera, the raised hand, the stick, the violence frozen forever in time. He didn't fight when they came for him, just looked at the ground, nodded and said, "I knew you'd get here eventually." When they brought him in, he still had the walking stick carved smooth from years of use, its leather handle cracked with sweat and sun. I didn't go to Nevada. I stayed in the park, helping the team finish what we'd started cataloging, the last of the evidence, packing up the site before the snow came. But I followed every update, every court notice, every newspaper clipping. The FBI built the case piece by piece, the recordings, the pawned watch and backpack, the eyewitness accounts, and that photograph of his shadow over the Caldwells last morning. When it reached trial, he didn't deny it. He admitted to confronting them, said he'd been poaching trout near the creek when Sean recognized him from a previous citation. He said he only meant to scare them off. But the stick was in his hand, and when Sean lunged to protect his family, it all went wrong. Leona's scream, he said, echoed through the canyon. The kids froze. He panicked, shoved, struck, and in that wild instant, the ground gave way. They tumbled toward the spring, the unstable crust collapsing beneath them. He watched the water rise, the steam swallowing everything. He didn't try to help. He just walked away, taking what he could carry, their camera, the watch, the children's things, and disappeared into the wild. For 5 years, he stayed that way, moving between camps, wearing the guilt down to something small enough to ignore. When the verdict came, life without parole, the courtroom was silent. Miles was there, sitting in the back row. He told me later that Tate never once looked up, not when the sentence was read, not when the cuffs clicked shut. Maybe shame had finally found him. Maybe he just didn't care anymore. Either way, it was over. Closure is a strange word in work like this. People think it means peace, but it doesn't. It just means the story has an ending, even if it's one no one wanted. After the trial, the Caldwell's remains were declared unrecoverable. The geothermal activity and years of flooding had erased what the canyon didn't already hide. The official record calls them unfound, but we knew better. Their evidence was everywhere: the wolf, the backpack buckle, the drawings, the photographs. Proof that they lived, proof that they loved each other enough to go together. Miles stayed in touch for a while. He asked for copies of the evidence photos, not the crime scene ones, but the ones from their camera, the family by the creek, junipers, sketches, Dalton with his wolf. I sent them all. A few months later, he started something called the Caldwell Foundation, a small non-profit that funds safety programs for park visitors. Every year, they host workshops on backcountry awareness. Simple things like route checks, bear safety, and reporting procedures. Nothing about murder or tragedy, just prevention. It's his way of keeping their names tied to life, not loss. As for me, I stayed with the park another 5 years, though something in me shifted after that case. I stopped hiking alone. I checked every trail report twice, and sometimes when I'd stand at the trailhead watching families sign their permits, I'd catch myself scanning the tree line for movement that wasn't there. Yellowstone is still beautiful, too beautiful for its own good, but it's not the same to me. The quiet doesn't comfort anymore. It feels like the pause between heartbeats. Agent Breyer moved on to Washington, took a position in the Bureau's cold case division. We exchange holiday cards. She signs them, "Still chasing ghosts." I know what she means. There's always another canyon, another story buried in the ground waiting for someone to dig just deep enough to find it. The park installed a small bronze plaque near the Slow Creek trailhead the following summer. It's simple, barely noticeable unless you know to look 4 names, 1 date, and a single line etched beneath for every voice the wilderness kept. Sometimes hikers leave flowers, sometimes smooth stones from the creek. Once a child left a drawing of a wolf colored in blue crayon, the same shade as Juniper's backpack. The wind curled the edges until I pressed a small rock to hold it in place. Years later, I went back to Hell-Roaring Canyon. Not in uniform, not on duty, just me and the sound of my own boots. The fissure had changed, widened in places, filled in others. The smell of sulfur was weaker, the springs quieter. Nature had softened the edges as if trying to pretend it had never happened. I stood there for a long time, letting the air move around me. It felt smaller than I remembered, and somehow heavier, too. Before I left, I set a small stone near the rim. Nothing fancy, just a marker with their family name scratched in. The rock was still warm from the sun when I placed it down. Sometimes when I talk to new rangers, I tell them that the wilderness doesn't take sides. It doesn't protect, and it doesn't punish. It just is. It's the people who give it meaning, how they enter it, how they leave it, what they carry between. The Caldwells carried joy into that canyon. That part matters as much as anything. I think about the camera a lot, how it endured everything. The storms, the heat, the time buried in stone and still held onto their story. That little piece of technology became their voice when everything else failed. It makes you wonder how many truths are still out there, sealed away, waiting for the right light to hit them. In the years since, tourists still come by the thousands. They take photos by the same creek smile in the same light, never knowing what happened not far from where they stand. And maybe that's all right. Maybe the park deserves to be remembered for its beauty as much as its grief. But for those of us who were there, that beauty will always carry a shadow. On my last day before retirement, I walked through the Lamar Valley one more time. The grass was tall and gold, the bison moving slow across the horizon. The wind sounded like distant waves. I stopped at the ridge where the Caldwell's trail began and let the silence stretch. For a moment I could almost hear them, again the laughter of children, the soft click of a camera shutter, the voice of a father calling his family closer for one last picture. Then the wind shifted and it was gone. Maybe that's how remembrance works. Not a fixed thing, but a flicker that shows up when the light is right, when you're quiet enough to hear it. I've learned not to fight that kind of silence anymore. It's part of the story. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because sometimes the wilderness forgets, but we don't have to.